Under the shadow of a volcano that had slumbered for centuries, a small village nestled beside a tranquil river, where humans and wild animals shared the land of wind and sun. But nature is not always gentle. When the earth rages, lava surges, floods ravage, and storms roar, the line between man and beast blurs in a brutal struggle for survival. Hannah, a young woman gifted with the ability to understand the calls of the deep forest, is forced to lead the survivors through nature's unrelenting wrath. By her side are Kala, a loyal old elephant with blood-stained tusks, and Fawn, the alpha wolf with eyes as sharp as a blade. Together, they face not only natural disasters but also the greed and desperation of mankind. Amid the thunderous rage of the earth, an unlikely alliance is formed, where the strength of an elephant, the cunning of a wolf, and the resilience of humanity intertwine to challenge fate. But when the ashes settle, will they find the light of hope, or is this merely the beginning of another nightmare? This is a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the mysterious whispers of nature, sounds that only those who truly listen can understand. Part 1. A peaceful beginning that foretells danger. The small village of Eisendorf lay nestled beside the winding river, under the shadow of the long-dormant Schlafberg volcano. Wooden houses with red-tiled roofs stood among golden barley fields, where sheep grazed leisurely on the hillside. The Alps surrounded the valley, their endless pine forests painting a picture of serenity in the Austrian countryside. Hannah, a 20-year-old girl with long brown hair and striking blue eyes, lived with her grandmother in a small wooden house at the forest's edge. Since childhood, she had possessed a peculiar gift. She could understand the cries of hawks, sense the unease of brown bears through their low growls, and even read a wolf's intent in its piercing gaze. That morning, the crisp alpine air was disrupted by an unusually thick fog blanketing the valley. Standing atop a high hill, Hannah watched as hawks flew frantically across the gray sky, their cries out of rhythm, filled with panic. She descended toward the forest's edge, where Clara, an old female brown bear with shaggy fur, tattered ears, and dulled claws, was leading her cubs in search of honey among ancient pine trees. Clara halted, lifted her head to look at Hannah, then struck the ground 3 times with her claws, sending small tremors through the earth. Hannah could feel the tension in every impact. That night, Fenrir, the silver-furred alpha wolf, appeared at the village's outskirts, howling long and deep, his call soon echoed by his entire pack, their voices carrying through the mountain range. Hannah ran to the village gathering hall, warning the people of the strange omens. But the village elder, a hardened old man named Otto, dismissed her concerns. "It's just the winter winds shifting, girl. Don't frighten everyone over nothing." The villagers chuckled, and a few children playfully poked at the distant wolves with wooden sticks. Only Hannah's grandmother, her hands trembling, grasped Hannah's fingers and whispered, "I believe you, but they won't listen, not until it's too late." Just then, the earth trembled slightly, and from the peak of Schlafberg, a thin wisp of black smoke rose, dissolving into the cold gray sky. Part 2. Disaster strikes. At dawn the next day, Schlafberg awoke. A deafening explosion shattered the silence, sending avalanches of snow cascading down its slopes. Molten lava erupted from the volcano's mouth, flowing down the mountainside like the searing blood of an enraged Mother Earth, consuming pine forests and withered barley fields in its wake. A thick, choking cloud of black smoke engulfed the valley. The desperate tolling of the village church bell rang out, lost amid the cries of fleeing wildlife and the panicked screams of the villagers. Hannah shouted for everyone to run, but many stood frozen in terror, watching as their wooden homes were swallowed by the merciless flames. Before they could catch their breath, an ice flood from the river, caused by melting glaciers in the Alps under the intense heat of the lava, came roaring down. The freezing water carried mud, uprooted pine trees, and fragments of shattered wooden houses. Hannah grabbed her grandmother and a small group, an 8-year-old boy named Lucas, a nurse named Greta, and a hunter named Klaus, leading them up the hillside. But their path to higher ground was blocked by massive boulders from a landslide. Just then, Clara appeared, leading a group of bears. The old she-bear let out a deafening roar, using her immense strength to push the boulders aside, clearing the way for the group. Lava crept closer, its searing heat burning Hannah's face, nearly making her faint. But Clara's unwavering gaze pulled her back to reality. Fenrir and his wolf pack emerged from the ice-flooded forest, their fur drenched but their eyes glowing fiercely. They lunged forward, herding a frantic group of wild boars away from the humans, preventing a deadly stampede. Hannah shouted over the howling wind. "We have to trust them! They're helping us!" But Klaus, the hunter, raised his crossbow, aiming at Fenrir, growling. "Animals know nothing but instinct!" Hannah lunged, knocking the arrow off course, screaming. "If you don't trust them, we will all die!" Part 3. The Unlikely Alliance. The humans and animals narrowly escaped the lava, climbing onto a small hilltop amid the flooded pine forest. The icy alpine wind cut through their skin, and the rising water reached their knees. Hannah knelt before Clara, placing a hand on the bear's paw and whispering, "Thank you?" Clara let out a soft growl, pressing her nose against Hannah's shoulder in response. Fenrir approached Klaus, growling lowly but refraining from attacking, then turned to lead his pack in patrolling the perimeter of the hill, keeping watch for danger. Hannah urged the group. "We can't survive on our own. The animals understand this land better than we do. Let them lead us." Greta, the nurse, nodded in agreement, but Klaus muttered, "I still don't trust these beasts." At that moment, Lucas slipped and was swept away by the freezing current as he tried to reach Hannah. Clara immediately leaped into the water, using her claws to pull the boy onto her back before swimming steadily through the icy river, carrying him to safety. Klaus fell silent, lowering his crossbow to the ground. Above them, a flock of hawks began flying in a single direction, as if guiding the way. Hannah looked up and realized they were pointing toward a large cave on the slopes of the Alps. She shouted, "Follow them!" Clara led the bears in breaking fallen trees blocking the path. Fenrir and his wolves scouted ahead, while Hannah helped her grandmother and the rest of the group keep up. In the heart of the frozen mountains, a strange alliance between humans and animals was forged out of desperation. Part 4. The Climactic Struggle. The group squeezed into the cave, a dark, damp space where icy water dripped from the stone ceiling, but it was, for now, a refuge. Outside, a furious blizzard descended from the Alps. Thunder cracked through the sky, and violent winds carried blinding snow, causing loose rocks to tumble down the mountainside. The lava had reached the cave entrance, radiating unbearable heat, melting the ice outside, and threatening to consume everything within. Part 4. The Climactic Struggle. Hannah groped through the darkness, and discovered a narrow crevice at the back of the cave, leading to the other side of the mountain. But the passage was too tight. Only humans could squeeze through. Clara and the bears wouldn't fit. Hannah wrapped her arms around Clara's head, tears streaming down her face. "You have to come with me," she pleaded. But Clara let out a low growl and used her massive body to push Hannah toward the rock passage, silently ordering her to leave. The bears lined up, using their enormous bodies to block the cave entrance, holding back the advancing lava to buy more time. Fenrir let out a piercing howl and dashed into the raging blizzard. Hannah screamed for him to stop, but the wolf had already made his decision. He led his pack in a desperate run around a massive boulder that blocked their final escape route on the other side of the crevice. A bolt of lightning struck down, drawn to Fenrir's presence, shattering the boulder into pieces. But the cost was his own life. The great alpha wolf collapsed in the snowstorm, his silver-gray eyes slowly closing beneath the blanket of white. Hannah and the survivors crawled through the narrow passage, fleeing into the storm as the earth roared behind them. When she turned back, all she could see was the billowing black smoke and the fiery glow of lava consuming the cave. Part 5. A bitter end, but hope remains. The survivors set foot on a flat expanse beyond the Alps, untouched by the ice flood. The blizzard had subsided, and the setting sun painted the sky red over the snow-capped peaks, like a final farewell. Hannah fell to her knees on the cold grass, her trembling hands covering her face as she wept for Clara, Fenrir, and the friends they had lost. A hawk descended from the sky, landing gently on her shoulder, letting out a long cry, as if bidding farewell on behalf of the fallen. Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You did everything you could. Now it's time to begin again. Hannah wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and stood up. Before her lay a new land, a small valley with fertile soil and dense pine forests. She swore to build a village where humans no longer hunted or dominated animals, but lived alongside them as companions. The wind whispered through the Alps, carrying the voice of nature, a reminder that survival was not just about victory, but about learning respect. Chapter 6: Ashes and Seeds. After surviving nature's wrath, Hannah and the remaining survivors, her grandmother, little Lucas, Greta, and Klaus, stood on the new land, a vast meadow stretching beneath the towering Alps. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke from the distant Schlafberg volcano, but the ground beneath their feet was dry, untouched by the icy flood. Hannah held Lucas close as the boy trembled, still shaken from losing his mother to the freezing waters. Greta, the nurse, tended to everyone's wounds with torn strips from her coat, while Klaus stood silently apart, his gaze heavy with the weight of all they had witnessed. A sharp cry pierced the sky. The falcon, now named Stormwing by Hannah, circled above before landing on a broken pine trunk nearby, its golden eyes staring straight at her. Hannah felt the message it carried: this place is safe, but this is not the end. We need to build shelter, she said firmly. Her grandmother nodded and pulled a handful of barley seeds from a small fabric pouch, the only thing she had carried with her while fleeing. The ashes and melting snow will make the soil fertile, she said. But we must begin now. Klaus, once a hunter, started cutting dry pine branches to form the frame of a temporary shelter with a small axe. His hands trembled as memories of Fenrir's eyes, moments before his sacrifice in the blizzard, haunted him. Hannah noticed the change in him. She stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to prove anything anymore. We survived because of each other, not because of killing. Klaus met her gaze, his deep brown eyes dark with thought. Then, slowly, he nodded, and for the first time, he set his crossbow down on the ground. That night, the group managed to build a crude shelter from pine branches and old sheepskins salvaged from the wreckage. But just as they were drifting into sleep by the crackling fire, distant howls echoed through the valley. Hannah jolted awake, her heart pounding. This wasn't the howling wind of the Alps, nor the calls of wild beasts. It was the sound of strangers, other survivors from ruined villages, now carrying daggers in desperation, driven to looting in order to stay alive. Chapter 7: Fire in the Meadow. At dawn, as the first light touched the snow-covered peaks, the strangers arrived, about 10 of them, led by a towering man named Karl. A scar slashed across his face, and his eyes were as cold as the Alps themselves. They moved on makeshift sleds of scrap wood, armed with crude weapons, daggers, wooden spears, and carried what little food they had stolen from abandoned villages along the Inn River. Karl sneered as he saw Hannah's fragile shelter. You think this is home? Hand over everything or freeze to death. Hannah stepped forward unarmed, her gaze locked onto Karl's. We have nothing but seeds and hope. What do you expect to steal from ashes and snow? Karl snarled and raised his dagger, ready to strike. But a thunderous roar shook the air. From the edge of the pine forest, a massive grizzly bear, Brutus, the last surviving member of Clara's clan, charged forward. Its dark brown fur glistened under the pale morning sun, its red-rimmed eyes burning with fury. It planted itself between Hannah and the intruders, its massive claws digging into the frozen ground. Klaus instinctively reached for his crossbow, but Hannah stopped him with a raised hand. Don't shoot! He's protecting us. Brutus did not attack right away. He let out a deep warning growl, and Karl's men hesitated, stepping back onto the snow. Greta whispered. How did he know we were here? Hannah gave a sad smile. Clara sent him. But Karl wasn't ready to back down. He barked an order, and his men hurled wooden spears at Brutus. One lodged into the bear's shoulder. Brutus let out a roar of pain and charged, crushing one of their sleds under his massive weight. Stop! Hannah shouted. We can live together. We don't have to fight. Her voice cut through the icy wind, halting both sides for a moment. Karl glared at her, then scoffed. Live together? With weaklings like you? At that moment, Stormwing dived from the sky. Its talons tore through the shoulder of one of Karl's men, drawing a scream. Panic rippled through the group. Hannah seized the moment. Leave, or die under the claws of nature! Brutus stepped forward, the ground trembling beneath his massive frame, his breath misting in the cold air. Karl clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping his dagger, but in the end, he gave a sharp command to retreat. His gang disappeared into the tree line. Before vanishing into the woods, he threw one final threat over his shoulder. This isn't over. Chapter 8: The Seeds Sprout. After the confrontation, Hannah's group decided to fortify their settlement on the alpine meadow. Brutus stayed, though his wounded shoulder caused him to limp. Hannah treated the bear's injury with herbs Greta had gathered in the forest, angelica root and pine needles, whispering, "Thank you, friend of Clara." Brutus let out a low rumble, and pressed his nose against her hand in response. Klaus began to change. Instead of hunting, he used his skills to build fences from pine branches and stones. Little Lucas, despite his age, helped his grandmother plant the first barley seeds, his tiny hands digging small holes in the ashy soil. Weeks passed under the weak winter sun of the Alps, and tender barley shoots began to emerge from the ground, signaling a new beginning in this frozen land. But Hannah knew danger still lurked. One afternoon, Stormwing returned, screeching urgently against the gray sky. Hannah climbed a small hill and saw them from afar. Karl's group had returned, larger in number this time. They carried large nets made from old rope and sharper weapons, hunting knives and iron spears. They weren't just here to steal. They intended to claim this land as their own to survive the harsh winter. Hannah gathered everyone inside their cold shelter. "We can't run anymore. This is our home, and we must protect it." Klaus nodded, standing beside her for the first time without hesitation, holding an axe instead of his crossbow. Greta suggested, "Use the terrain. If they cross the meadow, we can use Brutus and Stormwing to our advantage." Hannah agreed but felt something stir inside her, an idea larger than just fighting back. She didn't just want to drive the enemy away. She wanted to make them understand that survival in the Alps meant learning to live together. That night, under the pale moonlight filtering through the pines, she sat beside the barley shoots swaying in the cold wind. She whispered to Stormwing, perched on a branch nearby, "If there's any magic left, bring my old friends back." The wind howled through the Alps, carrying distant echoes, perhaps the howl of Fenrir, or the roar of Clara. Hannah smiled, knowing their spirits were still watching over her from the snow-capped peaks. Chapter 9: Beneath the Blazing Moon. On the eve of battle, the air on the alpine meadow was heavy with an unspoken omen. Hannah stood atop a snow-covered hill, watching Karl's group set up camp not far away. Their torches flickered like predatory eyes in the freezing darkness. Their coarse laughter echoed through the valley, blending with the whistling whine through the towering pines. She clenched her fists, torn between her resolve to protect this land and her fear of losing more loved ones to the relentless cold of the Alps. Klaus stepped beside her, his voice low. "I was wrong not to believe in you from the start. This time, I stand with you." Hannah turned to him, recognizing the change in his eyes, no longer the arrogance of a hunter, but the commitment of a true ally. Little Lucas ran up, wrapping his arms around Hannah's leg through his thick wool coat. "Sister Hannah, will Brutus defeat them?" She ruffled his cap with a gentle smile. "Not just Brutus. All of us." Greta, using her skills as a healer, had prepared herbs from angelica root and torn fabric for bandages, but she murmured to Hannah, "If they outnumber us, we won't stand a chance. We need another way." Hannah nodded and looked up at the alpine sky. Stormwing soared high, its wings slicing through the brilliant moonlight shining between thin clouds. Then, an idea struck her. "We don't need to fight them head-on," Hannah said. "Let nature lead the way." The plan was devised in the freezing shelter. Hannah's group would lure Karl's men into a low-lying area near the meadow, where a thin layer of ice concealed soft, unstable ground made fragile by melting snow. Brutus would strike fear into their ranks, while Stormwing would guide them into the trap. Klaus growled. "If this fails, they'll kill us all in this cold," Hannah replied. If we don't try, they'll do it anyway. As the moon reached its highest point, casting silver light over the snowy meadow, Hannah's group prepared for what was to come. But before they could act, a distant sound broke the stillness, a faint howl, like Fenrir's call echoing through the mountains. She turned, seeing only darkness and the cold wind rustling through the pines, but her heart pounded. "You're still here, aren't you?" she whispered. Then she stepped forward into the freezing night. Chapter 10. The Trap Beneath the Sky and Earth. As dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, Karl's group launched their attack. Karl led the charge, wielding a massive axe borrowed from an abandoned lumber mill, his scarred face twisted in rage. "Give me this land, or die in the snow!" he bellowed. Hannah stood before their makeshift barricade of pine branches and stones, unarmed, with only Brutus by her side and Stormwing circling above. "You don't have to die," she shouted, her breath turning white in the cold air. "Live with us instead!" But Karl scoffed and gave the order to attack. Brutus roared and charged forward. His massive claws swept across the battlefield, sending two of Karl's men flying into the snow and dry grass. Stormwing dove from the sky, talons tearing into another man's shoulder, throwing the entire group into chaos on the frozen meadow. Hannah shouted to Klaus, "Lead them away!" Klaus tossed burning pine branches into the nearby grass, sending thick smoke billowing through the cold air. Coughing, Karl's men instinctively ran toward the smoke, right into the sunken ground Hannah had planned for them. The earth beneath them began to tremble. The thin ice cracked, revealing the softened ground below, loosened by the melting snow. One by one, Karl's men fell into the icy pits, trapped in the freezing mud and slush. Karl roared, desperately clinging to a small pine tree. But Brutus stepped forward and, with a single swipe of his claws, toppled the tree, sending Karl plunging into the frigid depths. His screams faded into the howling wind. Only a handful of survivors remained, shivering and kneeling on the snow, begging for mercy. Hannah stepped forward, her gaze firm but not cruel. "You may stay," she said, "but you will follow our rules: no theft, no killing." One of them, Thomas, nodded weakly, his lips turning blue from the cold. He confessed that Karl's group had once been survivors from another village along the Inn River, forced into banditry by the wrath of Schlafberg, the mountain. Hannah studied him for a moment and said, "Desperation is no excuse. But if you seek redemption, help us rebuild." Brutus stood still, his breath misting in the cold air, his old shoulder wound bleeding once more, staining his brown fur with crimson. Hannah wrapped her arms around his head, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Thank you?" But she knew this victory was only temporary. The Alps remained, cold and mysterious, with new challenges waiting beyond the horizon. Chapter 11. The Breath of the Forest. Months passed under the pale spring sun of the Alps. The land slowly revived. The young barley sprouts had grown into fields of green and golden hues, enough to feed the growing settlement, which now included Thomas and a few of Karl's surviving men. Brutus had become a symbol of strength and protection, often standing guard at the village's edge at night, his massive silhouette looming over the melting snow. Stormwing soared back and forth, carrying small pine branches as if helping to build the new wooden homes. But one day, the sky over the Alps darkened, not with smoke from Schlafberg, but with a strange, dense cloud hanging low, thick with the stench of sulfur. The ground trembled, not like the past earthquakes, but with a different, eerie rhythm. Hannah stood atop a small hill, sensing the unease in the cold air. Little Lucas ran to her, his voice shaking through his thick wool coat. "Sister Hannah, I heard something in the forest." She listened. Deep within the trees a sound rumbled, like the breath of 1,000 unseen creatures. She led Klaus and Thomas into the forest to investigate. Brutus followed, his heavy steps making the ground quiver, his breath forming white mist in the crisp spring air. As they ventured deeper into the pine woods, an unsettling sight unfolded. Hundreds of animals, deer, hares, owls, even a lynx, were fleeing, racing away from something unseen. Hannah looked ahead. The trees in the distance were beginning to tilt, as if pushed by an invisible force. "The wrath isn't over," Klaus murmured, gripping his newly forged axe. Hannah shook her head. No, this isn't a volcano or an avalanche. This is something else. Just then, the ground split beneath the moss and thinning snow. From the cracks, a dark vapor seeped out, carrying the foul stench of sulfur and decay. Stormwind shrieked in panic, circling above the treetops. Hannah turned to her group. We have to find the source. If we don't, this land will be destroyed again. Thomas stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute beneath his thick scarf. I'll go with you. I owe you my life. Klaus nodded. Brutus let out a low growl, as if agreeing to lead them forward. As they pressed deeper into the forest, Hannah heard whispers on the wind, not human voices, but those of Clara, Fenrir, and the spirits who had sacrificed themselves to the Alps. Save us! The voices murmured through the trees. Hannah clenched her fists, her wool gloves damp with melting snow. She knew this fight was no longer just for humans. It was for the very soul of the Alps itself.